What do you need to know about a punching bag? Well, first of all, you need a very smart approach to this piece of equipment. The thing is, the punching bag, just like a barbell, is actually quite traumatic. Without this equipment, a boxer won't be able to develop power. In other words, this equipment is necessary for building punching power and confidence. As for the risk of injury, the thing is, there are a lot of small bones in the hand, so it can break very easily. If you approach this equipment incorrectly, just one wrong punch and you might not be able to use it for a month to 6 months, simply because you'll get injured. Injuries can affect not only the bones, joints, and tendons, but also have an impact on the spine and brain. So essentially, you can seriously harm yourself very quickly with this equipment if you approach it incorrectly. You must not hit it mindlessly. This is directly related to the risk of injury. The second point, you need to know about this bag. Undoubtedly, Visti. This bag is the main piece of equipment for boxers. Basically, there's nothing more important than it. And roughly up to 80% of a boxer's time is spent on the punching bag, studying it, understanding it, and so on and so forth. The thing is, a punching bag is not a living person. And while a living person changes angles during a fight, shifts, changes direction, and so on, the punching bag remains stationary. The first thing you need to develop on the punching bag is your striking technique. Well, through the principle of conditioning. That is, while you are conditioning, your bones and joints become stronger, and once again, you improve your pinnu movement mechanics, meaning the direction of your strikes. In other words, you start to understand striking distance and what it really means. All of this is achieved through conditioning. This is the most important point. In fact, everything you see on the internet under the label of professional punch technique is actually just conditioning. There are many types of bag conditioning, where a boxer truly becomes stronger, in their lines, but also and in the direction of their punches. What is professional punch technique? Professional punch technique is a complete understanding of how a boxer adapts their form of essentially as if in a fighting stance. The thing is, if the boost bag doesn't change its position, then in a real fight, even the slightest deviation can simply lead to disaster. You might think that you're developing your punch technique. Yes, you are, but you're doing it on a bag, not on a real person, to develop your punch. On the bag, as if you were hitting a real opponent, you need to fully understand all the changes that happen in a fight. That's why, in reality, there are very few people in Russia who can actually teach you a professional punch, like a fast punch, an invisible punch, a jab, or a main punch, like a hook. In fact, you could probably count on your fingers, maybe a good 10 people in the whole country who truly understand what that is. So don't have any illusions about it. And honestly, I just feel sorry for these boys. They spend a year or two pounding away at the heavy bag, then step into the ring and can't show any of it. Why is that? Because they've gotten used to mindlessly hitting the bag. They're given half an hour to work on the bag. And for that whole half hour, they just tear it apart. Yes, he's developed his punch on the bag, but it won't work on a real opponent. So don't ruin yourselves, guys. Approach the heavy bag very, very intelligently. Now then, there are three main types of heavy bags: soft, hard, and medium. A soft bag, obviously, is for beginners. Let me explain. There are a lot of factors related to how heavy bags are filled. Specifically, when you're working with a bag. Why do you need a soft bag? Because your bones and muscles aren't strong yet? So, to avoid injuring your hands unnecessarily. it's better to practice on a soft bag. And then as needed, you should gradually increase the density of the bag. Let me explain. At the very beginning, if you're a beginner, you shouldn't wrap your hand, wear gloves, or put anything on. Not until you have the correct, proper fist position for striking. That is, the correct position of the fist itself, all its parts, the angle of the elbow, the extension of the shoulder. There are so many nuances that you simply need to practice. So don't wrap your hands. Hand wrapping is only for when you've really achieved a very high level of power. Notice when your punch, basically, would just break your hand, if it's not wrapped. You could actually fracture your hand. That's when you should do it. You need to be properly warmed up. That is, after a good dynamic warm-up, you can start conditioning your hands. I can show you the simplest conditioning exercises, the ones I started with. The most basic things. So first, warming up on the bag. Warming up on the bag involves both your legs and your hands. So first, you need to stand close to the bag, as close as you possibly can. Right at the back of your head, like this. Well, how much distance is there here? The simplest conditioning drills are done with a free hand. That is what you can do mechanically with your hand. Here's a blow from below. Proper professional punching technique comes after conditioning. After mastering professional punching technique, the most difficult part begins. This is when you start working on tactical and technical combinations, moves, and all sorts of complexities. In other words, you literally bring the bag to life. It suddenly becomes alive for you. Here everything is set up, footwork and all kinds of defensive movements. Your distance, how you stand, and where your opponent will move. You do all of this in your head through ideomotor training. So what is ideomotor training? It's visualization. For example, while sitting in a chair or lying down, you can actually imagine the entire picture of the fight. That is your whole fight scenario. In other words, all your movements are so well honed that with your eyes closed, you can picture the entire fight. You do the same thing with the back. Sometimes professional boxers, this often happens in my gym too. The guys who already understand what this is about, they work with the bag and mutter something under their breath. Like, hey, come here. Something like that, basically. That's why this piece of equipment wearing is actually quite challenging. This equipment can really injure you. That's why it's absolutely necessary to study it very carefully, step by step, starting with conditioning and progressing all the way to actual professional fight, so preparation. The first thing you get acquainted with through conditioning is the mechanics of movement. In other words, it's a very precise setup. Specifically from a physics standpoint, then there's also anatomical rigidity. So what does that mean? Anatomical rigidity refers to how your hands become stronger. Here's the first mistake. Boys tape up their hands and put on gloves. This applies to beginners. That is, their muscles haven't yet developed for compression, they haven't formed, or how should I put it, for the correct positioning of the fist when striking. And so they put their hands in such an uncomfortable position that during a punch, the line of impact changes so much that if they get used to this, it's very difficult to retrain the muscles to do it differently. It's easier to start everything from scratch. That's why the very first lessons, especially those focused on the mechanics of striking, should be done with bare hands. But once again, I want to emphasize that there is a certain degree of caution needed when it comes to conditioning. Because if you even rub the skin off, you shouldn't continue striking. God forbid you get some dirt in there. That would be a complete disaster. They might just remove the bone and that's it. You'd be disabled for life. So take care of yourself when you're working with the bag. You shouldn't hit it thoughtlessly. Every movement you make every muscle action should be guided by your mind. Because, as I repeat once again, boxing is in your head. If you develop the wrong habits, you'll act incorrectly. In other words, this bag can harm you and your training if you approach it the wrong way. The line of your punch, the complex angles of your punches. All of that is also set up, and it's all done with understanding. And here's the most interesting part, the punching distance. In boxing, they say right that there are 3 main distances. But during a fight, when you're actually boxing, there's only one distance for you, the striking distance, where you can reach your opponent, whether it's close, far, or medium, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is the feeling of that distance, that you can operate at all ranges. In other words, you don't just consider one distance, you consider all distances. That's why it's better not to mess around with this piece of equipment. It's better to perform all movements when you're working on the bag or setting up slowly and calmly at first with calculation. I like that word, because you really do calculate everything. And then over time, you gradually speed things up and increase the intensity. Later, once your hands are conditioned, you can do it without wraps or gloves, because you also need to get used to that. And especially when even professionals tape up their hands, the wraps, well, in competition, the wraps can be up to 7 meters long, 7 meters of gauze wrap. In everyday training, people use 4 or 5 meter wraps. Even the way they wrap them is all over the place. With professional preparation, well, the development of your punch depends on a 3-part system, sparring, mitt work, and the heavy bag. These 3 things help you set the right direction, line, distance, everything, absolutely everything, all together in one. So if you only train with the heavy bag, you're just unfortunate. Just unfortunate. A single bag is not enough for a powerful punch. You need mitt work, mirror drills, and definitely sparring exercises as well. Let me say it again. A person changes in a fight. There's no way you'll hit a live opponent the same way. You hit a heavy bag, he simply won't let you, especially if he's at least somewhat prepared. Well, the only thing I can tell you is that in terms of tactical patterns, when you're already working and understand these changes, your goal in a fight is to maneuver your opponent into an angle. Whoop, you've practiced on the bag. In other words, you actually force him into a situation where you know for sure that this punch will land right on target, 100%. Aiming in tactical work is set up the same way, on the bag, in a fight, on pads, and on all sorts of pneumatic equipment. There are a lot of related factors involved. You can't look at the bag from just one perspective. Just because you hit the bag doesn't mean you've become a boxer. Nothing of the sort. Look, there are boxing bags hanging in fitness centers, in gyms, but that doesn't make people boxers. On a boxing bag, you don't just practice the punch itself, but also all kinds of defenses and defensive actions. How to lean into it properly, how to block a punch correctly, where and what to do. Lots of different things are stuffed in. There are exercises that condition the body. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. There's another point. When the bag is pressing against you, when it's pushing on you, that's when you're really working with it. But there's also an exercise where you literally catch the bag in motion, accurately timing your own step. Here you can perform maneuvers from a defensive standpoint, for example, a slip, a strike, hitting from an angle. Duck strike, duck strike. You can practice all ranges on it. In the next videos, we will definitely explain in detail all the different ways to condition the bag and how to practice short, medium, and long strikes on it. and possible combinations, certain techniques, without which boxing would simply be lacking. That's why it's absolutely necessary to practice them.